those of us fortunate enough to live in the developed world could potentially benefit from ever cheaper imports. In these circumstances, prices might fall relative to wages and profits, leading to real income gains. This was a good deflation, similar to that witnessed in the late 19th century. If, however, globalization threatened to go into reverse, as I warned in my last book, Grave New World, the risk was that these deflationary gains might turn into inflationary losses. Second, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a great deal of discussion among economists and policymakers about scarring. The idea was that even as lockdowns came to an end, economies would be unable to return to normal anytime soon. Not all economies would reopen at the same time, thereby hampering global supply chains, while the surge in debt levels during the pandemic might impose a deadweight loss on future growth prospects. To me, however, scarring raised important risks that others were ignoring. If supply was unable to keep up with the newly unlocked demand, inflation might be the natural consequence. Meanwhile, for governments keen to build back better, getting rid of debt via inflation might prove to be a politically expedient, if economically undesirable option. Third, while the initial collapse in economic activity associated with lockdowns was as big as had been seen during the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the similarities ended there. There were no bank failures, no crunching deflation, no mass bankruptcies, and no lasting increase in unemployment. Fiscal policy, in the form of loan guarantees, cash grants, and furlough schemes, prevented a collapse of the economic infrastructure. Monetary policy, however, was loosened, as if we were on the verge of another Depression-era financial calamity. When it turned out that we weren't, there was a marked reluctance to tighten until, from the perspective of price stability, it was too late. Fourth, it struck me that central banks had completely taken the view that, whatever happened in the near term, their policies would remain credible in the eyes of the public and that, as such, there was little chance of inflation running amok. This, I thought, represented a serious misreading of history and is one reason why this book delves into the past to cast light on the inflationary problems that have emerged during the pandemic and its aftermath. Blaming President Putin is, more than anything, an ex-post act of convenience, following a pattern established by policymakers most visibly in the early 1970s. Yes, inflation would have been lower had Russia not invaded Ukraine. It would not, however, have returned to target. I summarized some of these views in an article I penned for the London Evening Standard in May 2021. I wasn't the only person expressing my concerns regarding inflation. Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary, and Jason Furman, former chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisers, had issued warnings about rising inflationary pressures in the U.S. And Martin Wolf was writing articles in the Financial Times cautioning about a return of inflation at the global level. Roger Bootle, who had once signaled the death of inflation, began to write about its resurrection. Andy Haldane, the Bank of England's chief economist, warned in February 2021 that inflationary risks were skewed to the upside. Earlier still, Richard Cookson, on behalf of Bloomberg, had composed robust attacks on those content to ignore signs of an emerging inflationary problem. In the Evening Standard article, I wrote that there are plenty of people who believe that the recent inflationary uptick will peter out in a few months. Chief among them are the world's central bankers. I added that our policymakers are keeping the monetary and fiscal sluices wide open, yet, as with the early 70s, it may be that the economic rules of the game have changed. These are the kinds of conditions in which policymakers make mistakes, wedded to a version of the world that may not.